FaceTime. Call that exposed. Minnesota's biggest mistake? Karl-Anthony Towns didn't just win a championship in New York, he may have exposed the one decision that could eventually push Anthony Edwards away from Minnesota. Because the moment the final buzzer sounded, the confetti was falling, the crowd was shaking, and KAT was standing there with the Larry O'Brien trophy in his hands. He didn't run to a sponsor. He didn't make it about revenge. He picked up his phone and called Anthony Edwards. That FaceTime call said everything. On one side was Towns, now an NBA champion with the New York Knicks. On the other side was Ant, still in Minnesota, still carrying the weight of a franchise that keeps asking him to be great while slowly taking away the pieces that helped him survive. And that is why this story cuts so deep. When Minnesota traded Towns, the front office could explain it with numbers. Salary pressure. Second apron concerns. Long-term flexibility. But basketball is not played on a spreadsheet. It is played in trust, chemistry, spacing, leadership, and belief. And for Anthony Edwards, KAT was not just another teammate, that was his brother. The problem is, since Towns left, Edwards has been treated like a one-man army. Defenses load up on him, two defenders come early, driving lanes close faster. Every big moment becomes harder because the player who once pulled pressure away from him is now winning somewhere else. And that is what makes KAT's championship feel so painful for Timberwolves fans. Minnesota traded away a star to protect its future, but now the star they traded is wearing a ring, while the superstar they kept is surrounded by question. No, Anthony Edwards has not asked out, but the league is watching, insiders are talking, fans are connecting the dots, and every time Minnesota makes another money-first move, the same question gets louder. How long can they keep Ant believing? Before we go deeper, comment where you are watching from. If you think Minnesota made a huge mistake trading KAT, press 1. If you think the Wolves can still fix this around Anthony Edwards, press 2. And subscribe, because this story is only getting louder from here. The trade that changed everything. To understand why that FaceTime call hit so hard, you have to go back to the night Minnesota changed the entire direction of Anthony Edwards' career without warning him first. The Timberwolves did not just trade Karl-Anthony Towns. They traded away the one player who had grown with Ant through the ugly years, the playoff pain, the national doubts, and the rise from a team people laughed at into a team people finally feared. When the news broke, Edwards was not sitting in a meeting with the front office. He was not part of some long conversation about the future. He was on a plane. By the time he landed, the deal was already public. Towns was headed to New York, and Minnesota was moving forward with Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and the idea that financial flexibility could replace years of trust. That is the part fans still cannot ignore. The Wolves could explain the trade as smart business. They could talk about salary pressure, long-term planning, and avoiding future penalties. But Anthony Edwards was not thinking like an accountant. He was thinking like a competitor who had just lost his brother. KAT and Ant were not perfect. No duo is. But they had built something real. Towns gave Edwards space. Edwards gave Towns a new edge. Together, they helped drag Minnesota into relevance. They gave the fan base a reason to believe that maybe, after years of disappointment, this franchise finally had a real championship window. Then suddenly, that window was rebuilt overnight. And the most painful image was not even the trade itself. It was what came after. Towns, alone in a gym at 3 a.m, already working. Edwards, trying to process that the foundation around him had changed before he even had a chance to speak. That is when the quiet frustration began. Not loud enough to become a trade demand, not dramatic enough to become a breaking news headline, but real enough to sit underneath every possession, every double team, every playoff exit, and every front office explanation that followed. Because when a superstar feels like the plan around him is changing faster than the team is improving, trust becomes fragile. And in Minnesota, that trust was already starting to crack. Life without KAT became a trap for Ant. Once Karl-Anthony Towns left, every defense in the league understood the same thing. Anthony Edwards was now the entire target. The Wolves still had talent, but they no longer had the same kind of offensive gravity. They no longer had a 7-footer who could stretch the floor, pull a big man out of the paint, and punish teams for loading up on Ant. That changed everything. Before, when Edwards attacked, KAT's shooting forced defenses to make a choice. Help too much, and Towns could burn you from deep. Stay home, and Ant could explode downhill. That balance mattered. It gave Minnesota shape. It gave Edwards space. It gave the Wolves a way to survive when playoff defenses tightened. After the trade, that balance disappeared. Now Ant catches the ball and sees 2 defenders before he even makes his first move. He drives, and the lane is already crowded. He tries to isolate, and help is waiting. He looks for air, and the court feels smaller than it should for a player with his talent. That is not just annoying. Over time, it becomes exhausting. Julius Randle is a strong player. He can score, he can rebound, he can create some offense, but he does not bend to defense the way Towns did. He does not scare opponents as a long-range big man. He often wants to operate in similar areas of the floor, which means defenders can stay closer to the paint and make Ant's job even harder. That is why the frustration makes sense. Edwards is not upset because basketball is difficult. Great players expect pressure. He is upset because Minnesota removed the one teammate who made that pressure easier to manage, then asked him to carry even more. And the numbers, the film, and the eye test all tell the same story. Ant is still great, but greatness without the right help can become a burden. Every night becomes a wrestling match. Every fourth quarter becomes a wall. Every playoff defense becomes a trap designed to force the ball out of his hand. Minnesota did not just lose KAT's points. They lost his spacing. They lost his chemistry with Ant. They lost the pressure he put on opposing coaches, and Anthony Edwards has been living inside the consequences ever since. The replacement never replaced the problem. When Minnesota brought in Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo, the organization wanted the deal to sound balanced. They wanted fans to believe the Wolves had not taken a step back, just changed shape. Instead of one expensive star, they had depth, toughness, flexibility, and a new path forward. But championship windows do not wait for public relations. The problem was simple. Minnesota did not only need good players, they needed the right players around Anthony Edwards. That is a very different conversation. A star like Ant needs space, shooting, quick decisions, and someone who can punish defenses when two bodies fly at him. The Wolves needed a co-star who made Ant's life easier, not one who made the court feel more crowded. Randle gave effort. He gave production. But the fit always felt imperfect. He could create his own shot, but he did not open the game for Edwards the way Cat did. He could attack mismatches, but he could not force big defenders to leave the rim every possession. And in the playoffs, when spacing becomes oxygen, Minnesota often looked like a team holding its breath. That is where the trade began to feel heavier. It was not just that Towns was gone, it was that the replacement plan did not fully answer the question Minnesota created for itself. Then came the next blow. Randle, the centerpiece of the Cat return, was later moved again in what many viewed as another money-driven decision. That made fans look back and ask the painful question. If the Wolves traded KAT for flexibility, then moved Randle for more financial relief, what was the real basketball plan? That question matters because Anthony Edwards is not waiting forever. He is watching peers across the league compete with rosters built to maximize their strengths. He is watching organizations move aggressively. He is watching former teammates win, and he is watching Minnesota explain each move like patience is enough, but patience only works when progress is visible. For Ant, this is not about one trade or one bad matchup. It is about whether Minnesota truly understands what kind of player it has. When a franchise gets a superstar, the mission becomes simple: build around him with urgency, clarity, and courage. Right now, the Wolves are still trying to prove they can do that. The frustration was never just one moment. Anthony Edwards is emotional because he cares. That is what makes him different. He does not hide behind empty answers. He does not pretend losing feels acceptable. When something is wrong, you can see it in his face, hear it in his voice, and feel it in the way he talks about the game. So when reports started saying Ant had been frustrated since the KAT trade, it did not feel shocking. It felt like confirmation, because the signs had already been there. There were nights when Edwards looked tired of seeing the same defensive coverage over and over. Nights when he passed out of double teams and watched possession stall. Nights when he did everything possible only for Minnesota to run into the same wall again. And eventually, even the strongest competitor starts asking why the wall is still there. This is where the story becomes bigger than basketball tactics. It becomes emotional. Ant lost a teammate he trusted. Then he lost space on the floor. Then he lost some control over how his own greatness could be used. That is a dangerous combination, not because he is ready to leave today, but because frustration rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly. One decision, one playoff loss, one awkward roster move, one more night of being trapped by two defenders while the rest of the league watches. And the league is always watching. Other teams know how this works. They know superstars usually do not ask out at the beginning of the problem. They ask out after years of small disappointments become one big conclusion. They ask out when belief turns into doubt. They ask out when the organization keeps saying the right things, but the roster keeps telling a different story. That is why Minnesota has to be careful. Ant is not just another young star. He is the identity of the franchise. He is the energy, the confidence, the ticket sales, the national attention, the reason people believe the Timberwolves can matter. If he starts to wonder whether his best years are being managed correctly, the entire league will hear the silence before he ever says a word. And that is the scary part for Minnesota. The crisis may not be here yet, but the ingredients are already on the table. KAT's ring made the trade look even worse. Nothing changes a basketball debate faster than a championship ring. Before KAT won in New York, Minnesota fans could still argue both sides. Maybe the trade was painful, but necessary. Maybe the Wolves needed flexibility. Maybe Towns was too expensive. Maybe the fit had reached its ceiling. Then KAT lifted the trophy. Suddenly, the conversation changed. It was no longer just about what Minnesota saved. It became about what Minnesota lost. The player they moved for financial reasons had just helped deliver a championship to one of the loudest basketball cities in America. And the image was brutal. KAT celebrating in New York while Anthony Edwards was still in Minnesota, still waiting for the front office to find the right formula. That is why the ring matters so much. It gave the trade a scoreboard. Front offices can defend decisions with logic, fans can debate contracts, analysts can argue roster construction, but a championship cuts through all of that. KAT went somewhere else and proved he could be part of a winning equation at the highest level. For Minnesota, that stings because Towns was not some random veteran who left at the end of his career. He was one of the faces of the franchise. He went through losing seasons. He carried expectations. He built chemistry with Edwards. He had flaws, but he also had rare skills that made Ant's life easier. And when he finally won, he still called Edwards. That call made the story feel personal again. It reminded everyone that this was not just a business transaction. It was a broken partnership. A championship dream that Minnesota once imagined for itself had arrived somewhere else. The trophy did not come to Minneapolis. It went to New York, and one of the players who helped build the Wolves' rise was holding it in another jersey. Meanwhile, the Wolves were left with questions. Did they choose the wrong contract to move? Did they underestimate what Cat meant to Ant? Did they mistake financial relief for basketball progress? Did they open the door to a future problem with Edward? Nobody can say the answer is final yet. But after KAT's ring, the pressure on Minnesota became impossible to ignore. Because now the past is not just haunting them, it is wearing a championship hat. The NBA vultures are already circling. In the NBA, a superstar does not need to request a trade for other teams to start preparing. They just need to sense uncertainty, a little frustration, a few questionable roster moves, a front office under pressure, a young star watching other players win faster than him. That is when the vultures start circling. And Anthony Edwards is exactly the kind of player every franchise would dream about. Young, explosive, marketable, fearless, built for playoff moments, built for national television, built to become the face of a team for the next decade. If there is even a small chance he could become available one day, the rest of the league is going to monitor every signal. That does not mean Ant is leaving. It means Minnesota cannot afford to be careless. Because other teams will not wait politely. They will stockpile picks. They will clear salary. They will watch his body language. They will listen to every quote. They will study every loss. They will ask themselves the same question over and over. If Minnesota fails him, can we be ready? This is how modern NBA pressure works. It does not always begin with a public demand. Sometimes it begins with noise, then speculation, then reports, then one phrase from an insider that makes everyone lean forward. And suddenly, a franchise that thought it had time realizes the entire league has turned its superstar into a future target. That is the danger for the Timberwolves. They may believe Edwards is loyal. They may believe 3 years on his contract gives them safety. They may believe winning enough games will calm the conversation. But loyalty is not a substitute for roster building. Contract years are not a shield from pressure. And regular season success does not erase playoff frustration. When the same problems keep showing up, Ant wants to win. That is the core of this entire story. He is not asking for special treatment. He is asking for a team that makes sense around him. A team that lets him attack instead of survive. A team that gives him a real second option when defense is overload. If Minnesota gives him that, the rumors can fade. If they do not, the vultures will not just circle, they will get closer. Minnesota still has a path, but it is narrow. The Timberwolves are not finished. That is important to say because this is not a hopeless situation yet. Anthony Edwards is still in Minnesota. He is still under contract. He is still good enough to lift a franchise on his back. The Wolves still have defensive talent, playoff experience, a passionate fan base, and enough pieces to believe the story does not have to end with frustration. But the path forward is no longer wide. It is narrow, dangerous, and full of pressure. Minnesota cannot simply run the same idea back and expect the noise to disappear. They cannot tell Edwards to be patient while giving him the same offensive problems year after year. They cannot keep asking him to beat double teams with willpower alone. At some point, every superstar needs the game to make sense around. And right now, that is the biggest problem. The Wolves need to solve the Anthony Edwards puzzle. That puzzle is clear. He needs a real offensive partner. Not just another useful player, not just another tough defender, not just another name that looks good in a trade graphic. He needs someone who changes the way defenses guard him. That could be a shooter with size. It could be a secondary creator who can attack closeouts. It could be a big man who stretches the floor. It could be a guard who punishes traps and keeps the offense alive when Ant gives the ball up. But whatever the move is, it has to answer one simple question. Does this make teams afraid to double Anthony Edwards? If the answer is no, it is not enough. Because when Ant sees two defenders, Minnesota needs the next pass to become a threat. If the defense rotates, someone has to make them pay. If the lane is crowded, someone has to pull a big man away from the rim. If the game slows down in the playoffs, someone besides Edwards has to create a clean look. That is what KAT used to do. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. His presence forced decisions. His shooting changed spacing. His connection with Ant gave Minnesota a structure that defenses had to respect. Without that, the Wolves have been trying to replace a unique skill set with pieces that do not fully solve the same problem. Minnesota also has the rebuild trust. That part may be even more important than the roster. Edwards has to feel like the organization is not just managing money, but chasing greatness. He has to believe the front office sees the same urgency he feels. He has to know that when he sacrifices his body, takes the toughest shots, and carries the face of the franchise, the team will respond with ambition. Stars notice everything. They notice when management goes all in. They notice when ownership is willing to spend. They notice when a front office moves with purpose. And they definitely notice when decisions feel more like cost control than championship hunger. That is why this offseason matters so much. Minnesota does not need to panic. Panic creates bad trades, bad contracts, and desperate moves that make everything worse. But they do need to act with direction. There is a difference between patience and hesitation. Patience is part of a plan. Hesitation is what happens when a team is afraid to choose. Right now, the Wolves need direction. They need clarity. They need to show Edwards that the next version of this team will not leave him trapped at the top of the floor while defenses load up on him over and over again. Because Ant's prime is not something coming 5 years from now. It is already here. The highlights are here. The expectations are here. The pressure is here. And if Minnesota wants to keep him believing, they have to prove that his best years will not be spent waiting for help that never arrived. The pressure is bigger because Ant can see everyone else winning. One of the hardest things for a young superstar is not just losing. It is watching players in your generation move closer to greatness while your own team keeps explaining why patience is necessary. Anthony Edwards is not blind. He sees what is happening across the league. He sees young stars getting help. He sees front offices taking big swings. He sees teams building identities around their best players. He sees organizations making aggressive moves when the window opens. And now, most painfully, he sees Karl-Anthony Towns wearing a championship ring after leaving Minnesota. That changes the emotional temperature of everything. Because Ant is competitive in a way that does not allow him to be comfortable with almost. He is not built to celebrate moral victories forever. A conference finals run is not enough if the next season ends with the same question. Great numbers are not enough if playoff defenses keep forcing the ball out of his hands. Being called the future of the league is not enough if the roster around him does not match that future. This is where Minnesota has to understand the mind of a superstar. Ant does not want excuses. He wants answers. He does not want sympathy for being double teamed. He wants teammates who make double teams dangerous. He does not want the organization to say they believe in him. He wants them to prove it through action, and every year matters. The NBA moves fast. A player can go from patient to frustrated, from frustrated to uncertain, from uncertain to available, faster than a franchise wants to admit. Minnesota has already seen how quickly narratives can change. One season, they were the rising power in the West. Now, people are asking whether their best player might eventually look elsewhere. That question does not appear out of nowhere. It grows when fans see a pattern. KAT gets traded, the offense gets tighter, Ant gets swarmed, the replacement does not fully replace him. Another money-driven move happens. Then KAT wins a title somewhere else. Suddenly, every decision gets judged harder than before. That is the danger of bad optics. Even if Minnesota believes it has a plan, the outside world sees a superstar being asked to wait while other stars are being supported. And when perception becomes loud enough, it can create pressure inside the locker room too. Ant does not need to say anything dramatic for people to understand the stakes. His body language, his post-game comments, his frustration after tough losses, all of it becomes part of the story. That is what happens when a franchise player reaches this level. Every moment becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a headline. Every roster move becomes a message. And the message Minnesota sends next has to be strong. If the Wolves respond correctly, This can become the turning point. They can use the pressure as motivation. They can build smarter. They can bring in the right type of help. They can show Ant that the organization is ready to match his ambition. They can turn the noise into fuel and make the KAT trade a painful chapter, not the beginning of the end. But if they respond slowly, the story will write itself. KAT won after leaving. Randall did not become the answer. Edwards kept getting trapped. Minnesota kept saving money. And eventually, the league stopped asking if Ant would leave and started asking when. That is the nightmare Minnesota must avoid. Because once a superstar stops believing, it is almost impossible to get that belief back. And if Minnesota wants Anthony Edwards to stay, compete, and become the face of a championship era, they cannot just tell him the future is bright. They have to build that future right in front of him. The real lesson Minnesota cannot ignore. The lesson here is bigger than one trade, one contract, or one emotional FaceTime call. It is about how a franchise treats the window it has when a true superstar is already in the building. Anthony Edwards is not a player Minnesota can replace. He is the kind of talent teams spend decades trying to find. When you have someone like that, every decision has to send the same message: we are building with you, not around excuses. That does not mean a front office should be reckless. Smart teams think long term. Smart teams manage money. Smart teams understand the salary cap. But the best teams also understand timing. There is a moment when caution becomes fear. There is a moment when flexibility becomes a cover for inaction. And there is a moment when a star begins to wonder whether the organization values winning as much as he does. Minnesota is standing near that moment. KAT's championship does not automatically mean the Wolves made the worst trade ever. Basketball is more complicated than that. But it does mean the decision deserves serious criticism because Towns' success in New York reminded everyone that he still had winning value. It reminded everyone that his connection with Ant mattered. And it reminded Minnesota that chemistry is not something you can always replace with cheaper pieces. The peaceful lesson is simple. Teams should not build out of fear, and players should not carry resentment forever. The best path forward is honesty. Minnesota has to be honest about what Ant needs. Edwards has to keep leading with maturity. And the organization must act with courage, not panic. If they do that, this story can still turn. Ant can still become the face of a winning era in Minnesota. The Wolves can still repair the trust, find the right co-star, and make this painful chapter part of a bigger comeback. But if they fail, that FaceTime call may be remembered as the moment the entire NBA realized Minnesota had let something special slip away. Now I want to hear from you. If you believe Anthony Edwards should stay and trust Minnesota, comment 1. If you think the Wolves are slowly pushing him toward the door, comment 2. Like this video, share it with another NBA fan, and subscribe for more NBA stories, drama, and real basketball breakdowns.